So there's two goals for this talk, and there's more slides than I would like because I'm trying to solve two goals, which I don't like doing. But one goal was kind of provide an overview of a bunch of ransomware attacks for those of you who aren't doing ransomware a lot and come from more traditional forensics, to kind of start the day off with kind of a baseline of knowledge there. And then the second is outline kind of the structure we use as part of our training and as part of our software to kind of help our customers get, kind of go through and look at ransomware investigations. I just realized that I have two number ones there that kind of broke. So formatting got screwed up here. This is interesting. So I have huge bullets. So who am I? I'm Brian Carey. I've been involved with DFIR for 20 plus years. Original author of Autopsy and SleuthKit, File System Forensic Analysis, which is now out of paper print. You can get it on a Kindle still. App-based technology. And at Basis, we build Autopsy and Cyber Triage. So Autopsy is, of course, the main theme of these events in the past. I often get asked a bunch of questions on how Autopsy and Cyber Triage are different. So here's a kind of high-level overview. Autopsy is what I call a general-purpose forensics tool. You can use it to investigate a whole variety of things, whether it's an HR investigation or a crime or counterterrorism, whatever it is, right? It's basically a tool that allows you access to data. You can search it, you can view it, but you have to know what's relevant, and you have to know what makes things relevant, or not, and what kind of data there could be. Cyber Triage, it started its life off as an autopsy module, but then kind of went off in its own direction, and it is basically hyper-focused on just intrusions. So it is useless for a bunch of other kinds of investigations, like a child exploitation case or something else, but it's all about collecting the artifacts for intrusions, account takeovers, malwares, various, et cetera, and doing scoring on those to kind of bubble up the things that are relevant. So it helps you answer questions about intrusions, but again, isn't going to be useful for a bunch of other kinds of investigations. So that's kind of just how they're different of these things. General purpose versus very focused on intrusions. These slides are really funny with the font. This talk is going to cover a lot of the highlights. I have a lot of links in here for other kind of context. But for those who are new to ransomware overall, a couple of great resources here. There's a book which you can actually get out front from the Recorded Future booth, and Alan's talking later on ransomware. The DFIR report.com folks are amazing. It's a great site. I have a bunch of examples in my talk from their stuff. If you haven't seen this site before, they basically monthly or every month or every couple of whatever publish basically a case study on some of the intrusions that they're seeing. So it provides a lot of great kind of public knowledge sharing on some attack scenarios, innards of those. So follow that if you haven't looked at it before. And also the Coveware provides some interesting quarterly updates on ransomware in terms of trends and things that they're seeing as part of some of their responses. So again, for those who are new to ransomware, these are kind of some good starting places beyond what you're seeing today. So part one of this is all about focusing on some example intrusions to kind of set the stage for these. I'm using 4 of them from the DFI report. Again, the goal here is that these are high-level summaries. If you want to dive deeper, they all have blog posts on them that kind of dive into the details for these. But the goal here is to kind of get some high-level context here in terms of what these attacks look like. My guess is that my talk is going to overlap a bunch with Harlan's after this, but we're going to find out. So, except he has far fewer slides than I do, I just saw. So this is the first talk, first one that's on here for our evil or Sodinokibi. I'm sure I'm butchering that. But here's the basic flow of what that attack was. So a malicious email attachment was opened. It downloaded the iced ID Trojan loader. That was then added as a scheduled task for some persistence on that beachhead initial computer. That was then used to download Cobalt Strike, which is another kind of red teaming tool turned into kind of used by attackers to do various things on there. So at this point, they've gotten someone's laptop or desktop or whatever from the email. Iced ID was downloaded, then Cobalt Strike was downloaded on there. They did a bunch of tools to kind of map out and look at the internal environment to figure out what was in there. They used Cobalt Strike to get on an Exchange server. So they were then launched their Cobalt Strike on the Exchange server using some SMB and PowerShell things to move around in their network. They then kind of went from the Exchange server to some domain controllers and other computers from that Exchange server. So they kind of went from the initial laptop to the Exchange and then kind of hopped around to some other computers from there. Eventually, they found some credentials by dumping LSAS on a bunch of computers, got some credentials, were able then to use RDP, and they then moved around a bunch of computers with RDP around the network. They found the data they wanted to get. They used rclone to exfiltrate some data up to their server so they could then kind of do, if you're not going to pay us for the key, we will release your secrets unless you pay us, the extortion routine. And then at that point, once they had their data out, they then deployed the ransomware using bits jobs to download from the domain controller to transfer over to the endpoints, and then they manually RDP'd into the endpoints to launch the encryption algorithm. So this is kind of the main flow of this. And there's 4 more examples after this that all have slight variations on this, but the goal is there's kind of some overlap with these, but they all have their subtle variations on these as well. So here's a possible diagram of this, looking at like these boxes are hosts. Again, these reports, trying to focus here on public reports here if things don't give, host names and details as part of these. But here's some example here on kind of the beachhead and a bunch of PowerShell and RDP going to various computers and Exchange and domain controllers in servers and systems. And as part of your investigation response to these, you want to find all the computers, of course, right, that the attacker was playing in to see, what's going on those various systems. So there's one example. Example 2, quantum. So again, another DFIR report one coming out in April. So very similar variation on this. Email was the initial attack vector, malicious attachment. Iced ID again was the loader that was used on that system. The beachhead has scheduled task added for the persistence on there. The attackers got some credentials from that beachhead. Cobalt Strike again was used, downloaded on that system and run there. It was run on other servers to perform infrastructure discovery in their environment. Then they used some remote desktop to log into other systems. So some same overlap here, right? We kind of got in with Iced ID, Cobalt Strike, bunch of Cobalt Strike moving around, some remote desktop moving around. They got access to the domain controller, and some other file share servers. But the difference here is how they actually deployed the ransomware. So in this case, instead of using bits jobs, they copied the executable to the $share on those systems. And then they used psexec and WMI to launch that executable once they'd been copied over. So there wasn't the manual RDP login to kind of launch these things. But otherwise, a lot of it's similar, right, in terms of the mechanisms that were used before that. So example 3, Conti. So this one's from a year ago, actually a year to date, based on the URL. Beachhead used Bazaar Loader now instead of Iced ID. They did some discovery. They used Cobalt Strike. They used WMI to launch some remote processes and do some lateral movement with RDP and Cobalt Strike beacons. That's kind of similar to what we saw with other ones in terms of the discovery and moving around. They eventually got access to the file and domain controllers, and now they exfiltrated data with SCP up to their hosts for kind of the exfiltration of that. And then they deployed that by manually launching Conti on several of the hosts. And in this case, Conti itself will self-propagate. So Conti will mount network shares from hosts they can access and then start encrypting them. So Conti is only run on a couple of computers, but it's able to kind of access the other computers in the network and encrypt them, which basically is a moral equivalent to the ransomware running on those. So it gets that spread, but only launched on a couple of things. So again, a lot of similarities, but differences here on terms of the loader that was used and the actual propagation efforts of that. One more example. So Bumblebee. So initial access was via phishing. In this case, Bumblebee was used for the loader instead of Bazaar or Iced ID. Again, Cobalt Strike was used. RDP was used to move around a bunch of these. These folks, though, installed AnyDesk on one of the servers for some persistence on there. So they actually installed their own kind of remote access, remote desktop software on there instead of just relying on Cobalt Strike or credentials. Tried a whole bunch of methods to get domain admin credentials, logging around, dumping LSAS in a bunch of places to try and get some good credentials for this. Eventually resorting to Kerber roasting to get a service account on there. And then once they had that, they were able to get on the domain controller, use Cobalt Strike there. And at that point, there was detection in place, and they were stopped. So the actual ransomware never happened on that. But kind of the main idea here of this one is, again, different loader. They actually installed their own software for some persistence in there to get back into this. And they logged into a lot of computers trying to find credentials for that in terms of trying to scope out and figure out all the places that the attacker could have been. One last example is one from a Microsoft report. It's a DFIR report on Black Cat. So in this case, the initial access was by some compromised credentials, and they RDP'd into the system. They then installed a couple of commercial tools, tool development software and ConnectWise on various hosts to get access and remotely control those systems. So less here about kind of the Cobalt Strike and more about kind of other commercial, remote admin tools that were used for that. They actually created a local admin account on the system for their persistence so they could get back in even if stuff was uninstalled. And then they downloaded Black Cat with Chrome, just went to the URL, downloaded it from the Black Cat URL, launched that. And like we saw with Conti, Black Cat has its own self-propagation. So they launched it on one or two systems. Black Cat has hard-coded credentials inside of it and basically uses PSExec to copy itself to other computers in the network. So they launch it at one or two places and then it propagates around to kind of get through all these things. So it's enough for kind of the overview, and for those who do this every day are like, yes, this is all boring, I live this life. But hopefully for those who don't see much of ransomware things, this provides kind of a good overview in terms of what the actual attacks look like. One important thing, which I guess is my assumptions to take away from Harlan's talk later on, is a whole lot of this is not actually about the executable. A whole lot of this is actually about all that discovery before with RDP and installing AnyDesk and Cobalt Strike and all these kinds of things. It's less about the actual executable for that. That's his talk later on. But the basic takeaway from this is there's a lot of variations, a lot of examples, and we found as part of kind of our training working customers on trying to kind of structure things. And I like to structure and organize things into kind of buckets to make things easier to kind of remember and work with, on trying to kind of structure kind of what the steps are and processes are that are kind of critical to a ransom investigation. So that created this whole effort here on kind of making this kind of framework that we're on here. So we made a framework, right? A framework about kind of phases of the attacks, right? There's a bunch of frameworks out there. There's like MITRE ATT&CK, there's Lockheed, Killchain, a bunch of these things. They all have different variations on them. I had some slides in here diving in details until I realized I had too many slides and I was going over time. But the basic idea here is that we're focusing on kind of a phased-based framework, right? Like the Lockheed Killchain, where it's more of like, these are the phases in the attack that you want to make sure you're kind of looking at to kind of make sure you're investigated. Whereas like the MITRE ATT&CK is more of a tactics framework on these are lateral movement, these RDP, et cetera. So some phases will be kind of automatic or implied based on the kind of ransomware involved. But this is the basic idea of giving kind of a structure to the phases in a ransomware attack to help you kind of work backwards from that. So here's a visual kind of overview on kind of what we're looking at as part of this. So we'll dive into each of these in a little bit more detail, but there's basically some phase of initial access, waving hands here on kind of what that actual method is. There's then kind of a bucket of phases that can occur in a variety of orders. There's no, this isn't like the kill chain where everything must occur in a certain sequence. These are all much more about, these should occur at some point or will occur at some point, but the order is kind of TBD on the attacker or what's provided by the ransomware. So things like installing a primary C2, privilege escalation, maybe a secondary C2, infrastructure discovery, data discovery, exfil, all kind of happen at some point, as we saw in the examples of kind of them floating around to kind of figure these things out. And then at some point, ransomware gets propagated and data gets encrypted are kind of the two final steps once all these other phases have been kind of figured out here. But the ultimate goal here is try and group these things in, so as part of your investigation, you can go through some of these things and figure out, I don't know about that yet. I don't know actually how they got credentials yet for admin. Let's make sure we actually focus on that for a while to see if we can check off that box and that phase as part of that. So let's dive into each of these, what these phases mean. So initial access phase is all about the attacker getting that initial access into the network. And it's important, as honestly, as responders and DFIR folks who are responding to a ransomware attack to eventually figure this out, because it tells you and the company, what you want to fix to basically, prevent this from happening again. And that beachhead system often has a lot of the other data that you're looking for. So if you haven't found the system, you're probably missing a bunch of things around the discovery and persistence and various things on there. Oftentimes you may find those things first and then realize that was the initial access method as well. But it's important to kind of know what this is, or at least try and figure out what this is, although this is can be the hardest to figure out as well. But common techniques here that are often seen are things around phishing. We saw that in a bunch of the examples from the DFIR report on phishing emails being a common way of getting someone to open the attachment and download various things. RDP, exposed RDP and stolen credentials, exploiting vulnerabilities in exchange or other things are all kind of the common things. This is where the Coveware reports are very interesting. They can kind of give kind of a summary on the common techniques that are currently been used in the past quarter that they saw with some of their clients. So phase one, right? Initial access. This is pretty kind of bread and butter here in terms of making sure that's figured out as part of the investigation. So kind of re-showing this every time to kind of make sure we know where we are here. So now we're entering kind of the phases that need to occur at some point, but figure that out in terms of when they can occur is kind of irrelevant. So second phase here is installing primary C2. Right, so there's a whole category of ransomware that we'll probably discuss in other talks later on today on either kind of, some folks call it hands-on. I think Microsoft used the term human-operated ransomware that really assume that there's going to be someone controlling things and looking at things. Not all of them do though. Some are fully automated and require no human kind of in the loop with these, but most of the hands-on ones require some level of interaction on that system. And so there's some C2 or command and control that gets installed at some point on there. It's important to find these because if you don't get rid of those, the attacker still has access and control into the network and can cause various things to occur. Some of them are persistent, so they'll restart after, they'll remain there for a long time. A bunch of other ones, though, like putting in a Cobalt Strike beacon that's in memory, may just go away once the computer's rebooted, and it's really there for kind of a short amount of time. For that discovery process. Depending on how long the ransomware attack takes, that may be good enough that they don't really care to retain access across reboots. Some will retain access for that, of course, and want that persistence on there. So common techniques on this are some of the loaders, which also have C2 capabilities. Cobalt Strike we saw a bunch, remote access software we saw before, with RDP or AnyDisk, ConnectWise, etc. All fit in this phase. So again, that's why you want to figure this out and find these. So kind of reviewing our diagram here. Some of the attacks will also have kind of a backup or a secondary C2 phase is part of this with additional persistence in case the primary ones are removed. So we saw this in some of the examples before of adding user accounts or installing kind of other software in there to kind of maintain that persistence as part of that. A bunch of attacks don't have this though. So this is kind of one of these optional ones that are good to look into, but may not be there just because the attacker is looking for hang around for a couple of days, encrypt things, and then be gone and just kind of get some money out of that process. Another phase on here is the privilege escalation. So, or credential access, basically getting some kind of domain access. Some attacks don't require this. There's some examples that I know Brian Moran's going to look into this afternoon as part of talk he and I are doing on like WannaCry doesn't require admin, right? Because WannaCry is all about kind of staying local on the system and doesn't need to kind of get admin to access domain controllers and various things. But a lot of attacks do want to get kind of admin credentials or service credentials at some point so that they can get onto the domain controller, which often won't allow user logins on that, so they have to get the domain or admin credentials to get onto there to then kind of make it easy to propagate, or other servers require that as well. It also helps them to be able to kind of kill various services on the system or access other kind of locked files. So this is kind of a key part of a lot of the intrusions, that to hunt around for that credential access. As we saw in some of the examples, this can happen on a bunch of places, right? One common technique is dumping the LSAS memory, which may have the passwords in there, but that only has accounts that logged into that computer. So it may be a bunch of moving around to find a computer that has the right accounts you're looking for. So we saw some examples before about popping around a bunch, dumping a lot of LSAS to kind of see what there was until they get the one they want to. So common examples here are dumping LSAS, Mimikatz, we saw Kerber roasting, or just UAC bypass things to kind of exploit issues on that computer to get admin on that system itself. So that's one of the phases on here as well. We have some C2, we have some proved escalation. Infrastructure discovery is a big phase of a bunch of these attacks, right? Where the attackers want to find the domain controllers, since that's a common way of propagating the ransomware out. Mainly because domain controllers are trusted computers in the organization, right? Most computers are mounting a share on there, so it's easy to distribute the ransomware from that system out to other places. You can use group policy objects and various things to kind of push data out. So domain controller is kind of a critical place to get access to kind of push data out as part of that. So when you look through some of these reports or respond to some of these, you'll see there's a lot of focus on tools like ADFINE and ADRecon that are all basically helping you to kind of map out the Active Directory infrastructure in these environments and figure out, kind of where the controllers are, what domains exist, and understand, kind of the scope of all these things. And there are other living off the land tools like ping and net to kind of understand what networks exist, what are reachable, and other such things. Again, there's a whole lot more depth than we kind of have time for as part of this today. This is kind of the main themes here. And then lastly, in this kind of other bubble of kind of phases that happen in various orders with this is the data discovery. So as I'm sure many people have heard, even if you aren't in this area of ransomware on a regular basis, but in the news, and I'm sure other talks will bring up as well, there's the kind of double or triple extortion approach here of also copying data off the hosts so that they can be posted online, and then kind of a threat to release that if the money's not paid. So as part of that, there's a process of trying to find that data and exfiltrate it out. Surprisingly, very few of the actual ransomware executables do this themselves. They kind of require more of a manual step on actually kind of poking around and finding these. So, but there is some phase on, looking in, finding the file share server, and then using various tools to copy them out to other file sharing sites. So this is kind of part of the process. It may just be on the file share server. It may be a bunch of other personal computers, whatever. But there again is this kind of phase of looking around, making sure the good data or valuable data that someone's going to pay for is known where it is and getting that off. So there's a lot of moving around to focus on the servers, looking at what's there, using tools like rclone or SFTP or SCP and various tools to kind of exfiltrate that data out from the endpoints. So that's kind of the bubble of data discovery. And then finally, once all this kind of stuff is figured out, where they have their command and control, they can kind of control part of the network, they figure out where the domain controllers are and the file servers are, they've logged into them, they've verified they can do stuff, they've copied data out, it's then kind of the time to actually do the actual ransomware part. This is really kind of the last final stage is really kind of the only part that's tied to the actual ransomware executable itself. And essentially, that executable needs to somehow get copied onto one or more victim systems and get launched. As we saw in some examples before, and you'll probably see more throughout the day of some of the examples, some of them will auto-propagate, so you just need to launch them on one computer, but they can kind of spread throughout the environment. Others are just focused on that, one computer, and you have to kind of do the effort to kind of launch it on the various systems. And knowing how this happened is kind of critical, right? A lot of these kind of investigations can occur with kind of tracing backwards to figure out kind of where that beachhead system was and working backwards from lateral movement. So kind of knowing how the propagation happened is important because it helps you to get back to kind of, that it went to the domain controller and you can then find from there how folks got in from there. Or maybe it was mounted by the $C$ share and no one actually logged into that system. So kind of knowing this is pretty important to kind of figure out kind of how to scope the overall investigation. And so lastly, the final step on this whole process is encryption, which is kind of the ultimate goal for a bunch of these attackers. And again, it can happen either from running locally on that system or having the drives mounted. You'll see different things in that case, right? If they're mounting the C drive, you're not going to see things like services get disabled and volume shadow necessarily disabled as part of that. But if it did run locally, they may do other things on there to kind of evade defensive things and make recovery harder. So this is how we kind of view things, right? In our kind of process and how we kind of talk to people about kind of viewing ransomware attacks in terms of these overall phases of these things. And even though there's a whole lot of variations on these things, they kind of bubble into kind of differences in some of these phases. And you can kind of methodically figure out kind of what you know and don't know as part of these. One thing I want to kind of point out, and this may be kind of very obvious for many people, but not, is that there's a difference between phases and hosts as part of these. So a given host could be used for many of these phases. I mean, a given host could be used for several of these phases as part of the attack. That beachhead could be used for pretty much all of these phases except for the actual encryption, or maybe the encryption is part of that. So keeping in mind here that there's kind of a concept here of looking for these phases, these roles, but you may have to go around to a lot of computers to do these things, or things like credential access may occur across many hosts, and you need to be looking around for a whole bunch of places to find all the hosts that were being accessed by that attacker. Questions before I go on? All right. So last step here in our final. What do we have? 8 minutes left before Harlan gets up here. 8 minutes left. All right. So final thing is like basically given that, right? How do we actually kind of use this framework as part of kind of our training and how, as part of things? So one is basically as kind of a checklist, right? As you're going through these things, anything is really kind of possible in terms of what the attacker could do, but having this as kind of a checklist makes this easier to figure out kind of what you know and don't know is part of that. And this isn't a checklist necessarily in terms of like, look for Cobalt Strike, look for this, but it's more of seeing if you have kind of like knowledge about what happened during this phase of the attack. So in this case, for example, we had a nice little piece of paper here of, we know how it propagated, right? We found that they use group policy objects to distribute, to copy the file from the domain controller to the victims, and then made a scheduled task to launch that, right? You can check that off of, all right, we know how it propagated, but we're not sure how they found the domain controller, or we're not sure how they figured out kind of the credentials for that, and you can kind of work your way through this to kind of keep you kind of honest in terms of what you know and don't know as part of that. So for example, we can start at the end with an encrypted system, kind of the victim systems that are kind of have a bunch of encryption on them, as part of their files. And step one could be, figure out how the actual encryption happened, right? You can figure out if the executable ran on that system or if it was mounted by some other system, on the network. So you can do things like get timestamps from the ransom notes and encrypted files and the extensions on there to get some kind of time range on when the attack kind of encryption started from there. Maybe based on the extensions and the notes, you can try to start to figure out what family it is. It could be a lie, but you can at least get some ideas on kind of what ransomware family was being used for that, to then start learning about how it propagates and kind of works through and figure out whether it needed to be locally or it could have been mounted from the system on there. You can look for things like if volume shadow is disabled on that system, which again implies more that the executable was run on there and was able to disable things where it couldn't have if the drive was mounted, where services disabled like Windows Defender, etc. If it was mounted, you would see things like network logins and things from the host that it came from that mounted those drives if they have the right audit level settings on there. You can see this drive was mounted by host X, and that could be your clue of go there, next to as part of that. As an example here, just kind of stuff that you may see as part of some things. This is some sample data that we have within Cyber Triage. This may be too small to go through here, but this is basically a victim system on within Cyber Triage on a bunch of the ransomware executables themselves were flagged up top there, and the bottom ones are looking at the ransomware notes on the bottom to kind of give you some indications on here's the executable itself, and then here's the activity with the notes. So diving in the Reversing Labs integration we have that gives you access to like 40 plus engines, say basically that 28 out of 28 engines identified Conti as Conti. So that's good that it was identified as Conti. So there we know then that it was kind of run that system and the executables are there for that. This is a cool new feature that actually is just coming out in the next release from the Recorded Future folks who bought Hatching, the sandbox. So you can also upload things to the Hatching integration, and it gives you kind of a sandbox rundown on Conti signatures. It's suspicious because it's accessing user content and changing them. You can see in the bottom there, it did some WMI things with shadow copies and things, so you can get kind of a sandbox results of the Conti executable itself on there as well. This is the alert on the ransomware notes that we have some heuristics on there that kind of flag, ransomware notes. In this case, you can see, if you could read that text, it's a little small, I think. But we found 150 copies of the same readme.txt file. That's a good sign. That's probably a ransomware note versus just kind of a general README file on there. So it gives you the date range on kind of the start and the ending of the README notes or the ransom notes on there. We don't show all 150 because they're irrelevant at some point, but kind of give you that range so you can use that as your starting point on moving backwards on. This is the first ransom note. What ran before that, even if it didn't get flagged as part of the malware scan, you can start to figure out which executable it may have been. So once you kind of go there, you can then focus on the propagation techniques and figure out kind of what launched the executable once you found that. In that case, we had Conti, but we can then figure out, was there a scheduled task to run it? Was it from PSExec? Was it from interactive login? And kind of work our way backwards from there to figure out which host was the one that actually propagated it for that. And then you can use logs available and kind of work your way backwards. If it did come from group policy, go back to the domain controller, right? If it came from interactive login, kind of go back to that system for that. Here's another kind of cyber triage screenshot on here. If you click on like a program runtime, we'll map through and kind of go through the sessions and figure out that this RDP session was going on during that time frame. And so, go to this host, from here and kind of mapping in all of the event logs and the login session data to kind of tie the activity back to a session and then help you kind of go back and that came from this host and you can then kind of add that to your chain of investigations going backwards. And then lastly, it's part of this kind of recursion process, right? And of course, other investigation types or approaches will then kind of like search. Once you find an indicator of Conti, right, of then kind of doing the broad search in your environment if you have that capability to look for all hosts that have that hash value or that IOC, on there. But again, this kind of a balancing on kind of the scoping and searching as well as diving into each host to figure out which indicators you actually should be searching for. So as you're going backwards, for each of these hosts, looking into things like inbound, outbound logins, because it could be that lateral movement, as we saw in those examples of RDP connections going around, looking for credentials on various hosts, looking for processes that could be malware, loaders, backdoors, C2, whatever. DNS cache and connections going to a host that could have been part of like the data exfiltration, looking for data discovery commands like simple things like ping and netstat or kind of AD find, et cetera. Users being created, backdoors, essentially anything's fair game on these hosts that you're going through, right? Because they could have been used for any of these phases before that. So as you're going through that, looking through anything's fair game, and then once you find them, doing that kind of network scoping and searching to find out kind of what the other hosts are with that you haven't found yet is part of that repeating. So is another kind of example on things that can be flagged for these things. Cyber triage will flag new remote logins, right? I'm kind of like, hey, this person logged in for the first time remotely, in the past 2 weeks. They've never had before. If you're already suspicious about this computer, right, that account's kind of suspicious now because they're kind of a new user, on the system. There's a variety of other kind of heuristics that you can apply as well to kind of go through these things and kind of look for them. I have 2 minutes left here. So kind of going back to the first example that we did as part of this, here's kind of a breakdown, kind of with these phases of, initial access we can break into. We know it was done with, an Excel spreadsheet attachment, the macro, and iced ID, the primary C2. We have Cobalt Strike on a lot of systems. No secondary C2 was found. Privilege escalation was done with some UAC bypass and dumping credentials on a bunch of the systems. The data exfil, they used rclone on one of the hosts. The propagation was done by bits jobs and then launched by RDP. And then the encryption happened, on that local data. There wasn't kind of the mounting of drives. So again, it's just kind of a way of now kind of rephrasing in the first example we saw into these kind of discrete phases to kind of figure out kind of what we know and don't know. So overall talk of this, right, is kind of the framework can help kind of provide some overall structure around investigations. There's a bunch of kind of, again, there's not a whole, perfectly honest, like kind of a lot of unique things in kind of, coming out as part of this is more of like giving people kind of a framework concept to think about their investigations, with this. You may not find all the evidence, of course, right? There may not be evidence left over on the systems for some of these things as part of that, but it's good to at least make sure you can say you've tried to fill in, kind of the holes and the gaps on a bunch of these phases. And then basically, just kind of the plug here on minor plug here, right? That we're kind of trying to work this into the overall cyber Trojan application itself to kind of work in more of these kind of checklist kind of things. If you look at a host and there's lateral movement coming in out of this of kind of making the checklist for, hey, you should check out host A, B, and C, right? And kind of incorporating in these kinds of concept of phases so that you can kind of map them into and kind of include your reportings and findings into them to kind of help you make kind of like in the app itself on where you are and what kind of about that. So if you haven't seen Cyber Trojan before, you can go to the booth, get a t-shirt, a lot of stickers over there as well. One final plug as well is that we're hiring. So we are hiring a director of training for those of you who actually want to do training. I know there's at least one person in the audience that we're talking to already for this, but we can't give the opportunity up on like if you want to do more training in various things on here, let us know. We are hiring to kind of help out and expand our training aspects. And here's the contact. Questions? If I have time. Yes.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
In most of your examples, they were going after volume shadow copies and those sorts of things. Where does that fit into the framework? I was looking at it and I couldn't map where deleting backups and those sorts of things would get.
So the question was where deleting backups and volume shadow fits the framework. So I don't have it in there, honestly, because to me, it's not necessarily part of answering kind of forensic questions. Like to me, it's a side effect of what may happen on the system that it runs on. But in terms of like scoping the investigation, it doesn't kind of help to figure out kind of where it is. So I guess I kind of indirectly bundle that into kind of the you guess kind of the encrypt phase as kind of a side effect of that, for better or for worse. But the talk that Brian Moran I have this afternoon does get more into that, I'd say. So. Yeah.
Do you have any examples of detailed after-action reports, lessons learned reports? Particularly, I was looking for any reports of analysis of the Baltimore ransomware incident, and there doesn't seem to be anybody who's gone into it in any significant depth.
So not as part of this talk, and I don't know the teams involved in the Baltimore one, honestly, to know what was released as part of that.
Any other ransomware attacks that somebody has documented with a degree of technical as well as organizational detail?
So there's a lot of incident response teams like the DFIR report and other ones that will kind of publish their kind of case studies as more of like informational sharing kind of thing.
Pretty generic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
In other words, no.
Yeah. I have no special knowledge that's not out there, I guess, or kind of what other people are sharing.
Nobody will pay you to do an analysis of their disaster.
Oh, well, I think plenty of places are paying for that. They just don't want it publicized to the world, right? It's like, yeah.
Yeah, that's usually directed by counsel. You were hired by counsel to do the analysis, and then now it's client.
Exactly. Yeah.
Are these slides shareable?
Yeah, I think they're already shared. Ali, are these already shared on the Whova app? Yeah.
They're on the agenda page.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, one last question as well. There is this should have been part of the opening remarks. There is a Q&A feature in the Whova app. We don't necessarily have a good way for that to get to speakers. So preferred of asking questions. If there are questions on the Whova app that don't get answered by the speakers, we will try to kind of make sure they can address them afterwards in the app themselves. So. Other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. All right.